Hello, in today's video we're going to be discussing the 8.5 section of your textbook that's titled Emancipation and the Life in Wartime. Okay, you can follow along with me on page 468 of your textbook if you'd like to as I go through it. Okay, so the first thing that we need to talk about is what the word emancipation means. Emancipation is a really fancy word that means to be set free. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about in this section is the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, so the Emancipation Proclamation is a really fancy way of saying that President Lincoln made a document that set the slaves free in Southern territory, so in the Confederacy. Now, there's a couple of things that are important about this, okay? The first thing to realize is that President Lincoln says himself, and it's right in your textbook, so I'm not making this up, page 469 at the top, that if he could have ended or kept the Union together, ended the war without freeing any slaves, he would have done that. He also says that if he could free all slaves and end the war and keep the Union together, he would also do that. And if he had to set some slaves free and leave others as slaves, he would do that. So he's not freeing these slaves because he's totally against slavery, because that's not the case. As he's a white male during this time period, he's definitely not totally against slavery. But he's freeing these slaves because he thinks it's the best way to save the Union. Okay, and there's another couple of things about this we need to talk about as well, is the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all slaves in the United States, in both the Confederacy and the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation only frees slaves in the Confederacy, which would be the South. Now, the second point about that is this. There are 4 states that are slave states in the North. Those states get to keep their slaves. President Lincoln only says the South has to set their slaves free. Now, here's why that doesn't work, but it's part of his plan. It doesn't set the slaves free in the South because, remember, the Confederacy broke away from the United States. Okay, they are not part of the Union. So therefore, President Lincoln making a law for them really doesn't make sense, because they're not going to follow it anyways, because they consider themselves a separate country. The reason, though, that he said that only the Confederacy or the South can't have slaves anymore is because if he'd have said that slavery is now totally illegal in all parts of the United States, including the states that were part of the Union, those states that did have slaves, like Missouri and Kentucky and a few other states that were part of the Union but still had slaves, may have left and joined the Confederacy, which would have given the Confederacy more resources. Okay, so he had to be kind of careful when he made this law that he didn't make any of the states that were part of the Union but still had slaves mad. So therefore, his law only affects the Confederacy, which doesn't really work. As it says right in your textbook, that on January 1st, 1863, when he makes that law and declares it, no slaves are actually set free. And this is because the Confederacy doesn't really care what law he's making, because they consider themselves their own country anyways. But it's kind of the idea that he's coming across. He wants to be really careful when he does this, because if he just, like I said, lets it go, then all 4 of those states that are part of the Union may have left. Okay, so it's a cautious introduction as it described in your textbook. Okay, this is a rather large proclamation, because just because you live in the North doesn't necessarily mean you are against slavery. For example, it talks about in your textbook how people in northern cities like Boston or New York, Philadelphia, etc., okay, may have been for slavery, or not necessarily for slavery, but they didn't want slavery to end, because they feared that if those slaves are set free, that they were going to take their jobs. Okay, so even people in the North who weren't necessarily against slavery didn't want slaves to be free because they were scared of losing their jobs. Okay, so when President Lincoln made this announcement, it made a lot of people upset and not necessarily happy, because they were afraid that when those slaves finally were free, they would not have a place to work because those slaves would take their jobs for less money. Okay, because slaves were set free in the South, it does cause some issues for the South, of course. Obviously, slaves hear this news that they were set free by President Lincoln, even though President Lincoln is not technically the president of their Confederacy. Okay, so those slaves start to slow down how much they're working. They aren't working as much. They might stop working altogether, which of course is going to get them in trouble. But by doing this, they're hoping that they weaken the Confederacy, make them not as powerful, give them less supplies, so that hopefully the Union Army can win sooner and they can be free. Okay. You're also going to read down at the bottom of page 470, it's got a whole section about how African Americans start to join and fight heroically for the Union. This is true, okay? At first, African Americans aren't allowed to fight in the military. However, after 1862, Congress passes a law that says they can join the military. However, they're not given good jobs. For example, they are building roads or guarding supplies, things like that. Okay, and they're only paid about half of what the white soldiers are paid. Well, in 1863, that finally changes. Enough people are dying in the war, things like that, that they decide that, okay, fine, African Americans can also fight in the war. So now in 1863, they are fighting in battles and all that good stuff, just like all the other soldiers, but they're not paid as much still. In 1864, Congress passes a law that says not only are they allowed to fight with all the other soldiers and all that stuff, but all soldiers will be paid equally. Okay, so this is actually a huge step, right? Because even in later years after the Civil War, you definitely can make the argument that women and people of color are not paid as much as white men. So the government passing a law that says in the military all African American males will be paid the same as white males that's way ahead of its time. Okay. As many as about 200,000 African Americans joined the Union to fight in the war, and about 40,000 of them die. So that's about 1 in every 5 African Americans that join the war end up dying because of it. And that's about consistent with the number of everybody. There was one whole regiment that it talks about. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was made up entirely of African Americans or people of color. Okay, it was one of the most famous or more famous regiments in the war because they had attacked Fort Wagner, which is a base in South Carolina. Okay, and they were kind of successful in the fact that they did get into Fort Wagner. However, there were a lot of soldiers and other artillery and things inside, so they were driven back. And eventually about half of that 54th Regiment did pass away. But it was successful, and it really drew attention to the African Americans in the war, including the first African American to win the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the highest award you can receive, after he passed away for his, I guess you should say, contributions to the war. There were also, I believe, 16 other African Americans that received the Congressional Medal of Honor during the Civil War. Moving on, you're going to kind of witness now what the soldiers saw and kind of experienced during the war. During the war, okay, obviously lots and lots of death tolls. And the reason why is because warfare at this time is not very advanced. So therefore, neither is technology or medicine, okay, which results in a lot of deaths that don't necessarily need or should have happened. I guess nothing needs to happen, but should have happened. Okay, and the reason why is because of more people are going to die of starvation and disease than from weapons. So at this time, medicine and knowledge of your diet wasn't really great. So therefore, in army camps and all this type of thing, soldiers are sleeping on the ground. They're really close quarters during cold times of the year. Disease spreads really fast. During the summer months, malaria is going to spread. Okay, obviously, lack of good diet is going to affect how healthy people are. So a lot of people are dying because of infection and disease. If you were injured in the war, let's say you got shot in the arm or the leg or something that normally wouldn't kill you, it didn't hit anything serious, that might have still killed you. In fact, it probably did, because at that time they didn't understand how bacteria and germs worked. So it would probably get infected and end up causing you to die. Because of that, if you were shot in the hand or something like that, a lot of times doctors would end up cutting or amputating a large part of that arm or leg or whatever it may be off, because they understood that if they cut that part of you off, then you had a better chance of survival. So that's a lot of why soldiers are dying in the war as well, from being shot and blown up and all that other stuff. But disease and infection, and then lack of food, is also starvation, is why people are dying too at such a high number. Political challenges in the North and South. So not everybody, obviously, just like any war throughout history, is on the same side as far as ideas go. Okay, so even if you are living in the North during this time period, you may not agree that the war should be going on, right? And that happens still in current times. If you look back on any of the recent conflicts that we've had, okay, if you live in the United States, you don't necessarily have to agree with the fact that we are involved in a conflict. It was that way then, too. There were lots of people in the North that did not agree with the fact that the North was fighting to keep the South part of it. They said that if the South wants to leave, just let it leave. Northerners who felt this way had a name made up for them, so other people called those people copperheads. Okay, that's a poisonous snake, and they called them this because they felt that attitude of just don't fight for the South could be very bad in the end. It could kind of poison the Union, in a sense, if that's what you want to call it. So they called those people copperheads if you didn't think that the war should be happening in the North. Other things that happened in politics because of the war was the draft. Okay, so the Civil War is going to be the first time that the United States experiences a draft, which is when the government passes a law that says men between an age of blank and blank can be drawn into the war, and you don't really have a choice to fight. That's how it is now. At this time, it's between the ages of 18 and 18 and 40. Okay, is when they can draft you. However, there were exemptions. So if you paid $300, which is pretty much what a little below average, so a working class person would make in a year, $300. If you paid $300, you did not have to fight in the war. Or you could hire somebody else to go for you. This doesn't sound so bad, right? Here's where the problem comes in. Okay, obviously normal people are not going to be able to pay that money, or poor people are not going to be able to pay that money. So a lot of people are calling this a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And what that means is the rich are choosing to do this war, right? The people that have power, like President Lincoln, etc., okay, are obviously above average as far as wealth goes. So they don't have to fight in the war. Okay, even if they were to get drafted, they don't have to fight. However, people with below average money, so poor or working class, okay, do not have that money to kind of get out of it. So therefore, those are the poor people that are fighting the war. So it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, meaning the poor people are fighting this war. Okay, and they don't like that. Because of that, they have what's called the draft riots. The draft riots are when people are starting to resent the idea of a draft because, like I said, it's only the poor people or the people that aren't able to pay that money that are being drafted. So they start to rebel. They say that this is, this is not fair, all the stuff. They're rioting in the streets. Okay. And eventually it ends up causing problems because obviously people are rebelling in the streets. It's not good for your government. President Lincoln has to try and shut this down. So he repeals what's called habeas corpus, okay, and that's a really fancy term. It's a legal term that pretty much states that if the government is going to put you in jail, they have to tell you why. Well, during these riots, Abraham Lincoln took that law away. He said that we're just going to put you in jail and we don't have to tell you why. Okay, he said that the Constitution allows people leaders to do this when in cases of rebellion or invasion and the public safety may require it. So basically he's saying because of a rebellion and the public safety, the safety of the public requires that I can put you people in jail and not tell you why. Okay, that's what he goes to. About 14,000 people were ended up putting in jail because of this. Okay, however, people were put in jail, so it's bad, but it's really not as bad as it could have been because out of all 14,000 of those people, hardly any specific crimes were ever charged, and hardly anybody ever went to trial. So pretty much as soon as it was over, they just let you go. But they had to kind of put you in jail to stop what was going on. A draft also happens in the South. Remember, the South is now a separate country, so they have to make their own laws. Jefferson Davis, who is the leader of the South, decides to pass a draft law as well. Now, remember, there are not as many people in the South, and they are poorer, so therefore they have the same law, but hardly anybody can pay their way out of it. Okay, so these people are fighting during the war. They're getting drafted. The draft age in the South, because there's so few people, ends up stretching. It's between the ages of like 15 and 50 that they're drafting these people. So 15-year-olds are fighting in this war because they were drafted for the South. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, kind of the scope of what we're looking at during the Civil War. It wasn't always, necessarily morally right. However, at the same time, these wide age groups are fighting. Robert E. Lee urges the Southern government to let African Americans fight, which is kind of weird, okay, because the South is fighting to keep slavery, but now they want the African Americans to fight for them. Okay, well, he wants this. Eventually, the South passes a law after much of, obviously they have problems. They're like, whoa, we're not going to let African Americans serve in our army. Eventually, they're getting their butts kicked enough. They go, okay, we need to do something, and they do decide to let African Americans fight. However, the war ends before more than a few thousand of them can ever fight in the Southern Army. The Civil War is going to be, moving on to our next point, the Civil War is going to be the first time that an income tax is ever introduced. Okay, and what income tax is the tax on the amount of money that you make. Okay, they still have these today. When you get a job, when you become an adult or in high school or whatever the case may be, you will pay income taxes, which is the government taking part of what you make in order to be able to pay for things. Okay. The North came up with an income tax in order to pay for part of the war. They said that, hey, war costs money. We have to figure out a way to come up with it. So people working had to pay part of what they made during the week or month or whatever the case may be to the government in order to pay for the war. Okay. They also came up with other ways, such as bonds, which is, remember, is borrowing money from citizens that you pay back later. And they also printed a bunch of money. Now, the issue with printing more money is it doesn't like, oh, we need $100, let's print $100. It doesn't work like that. If you print more money, okay, it makes money worth less. Think of it this way. So if you are, there's 1,000 $1 bills in the United States. So let's just make a round number for the point of this. 1,000 $1 bills. If you have one of that, you have one of the 1,000, right? So you have 1/1000th of the money. Now, if I print another 1,000 $1 bills, you have 1/2000th of the money. So your money is worth half as much as it used to be. So the more money you print, the less money is worth. So this actually causes inflation, which makes things more expensive and not as easy to buy. Okay, wartime economic advantages. Because of this, obviously, it's not all bad. So factories in the North, remember the North has lots of factories, end up producing lots of things which is good for the economy, such as shoes, rifles, coats, etc., bandages, all that stuff. Because it's getting made a lot, they are making more money in the North as far as the factories go. However, so the North is benefiting from the war. Actually, they're actually making more money. The South is the exact opposite. Remember, the South is based a majority of their economy on farming. If you haven't noticed, it's very hard to farm during a war. Okay, so therefore the South kind of falls apart. And remember, they have blockades too off their ports by the North, so they can't trade with Europe. So because they don't have factories, because they can't trade, and because farming is really hard, it devastates their economy. They cannot make money. They are really, really struggling. People are starving. They're not making money. Their life is not well, which really makes people in the South obviously not like the war. Okay. And then again, their book mentions is the blockades. The blockades, so shipping is how the South got a majority of its guns, a majority of its clothes. That's how they sold most of their cotton. Remember, they're selling their cotton to Europe and Britain. Okay, however, those blockades make it so that they cannot trade. They're not getting money, and they're not getting supplies. It's not good for them in their war effort. Okay. Finally, we're going to talk about contributions of women in the war effort. So obviously, men are being drafted now, which means you have to go serve in the army. You don't have a choice unless you can pay your way out of it. Okay, so women have to step into those jobs. Women are now working in factories. They're running farms, and they're doing all these jobs while also taking care of their families. Because of this, obviously, people realize that, hey, women are just as equal, or not just as equal, but they're more equal. Hey, they deserve some more rights. So people start to look more positively upon the women's rights movement, which is called suffrage. Okay, they start to realize that maybe they are a little more equal. Now, of course, women don't get their voting rights and things like that until the 1920s, which is wrong, but that's the way it was. All right, but they are starting to get looked at in a more positive light because they were able to step into men's places and do those jobs. Also, during the war, many women served as like nurses in both armies, the North and the South, which led to nursing being an acceptable profession for women even after the war. So that's kind of one good thing that did come out of the war for women. That's kind of where the section ends. If you have questions about anything that I talked about today, please feel free to email me or set up a time to talk one-on-one. Turn in your assignments, okay? Today, this video is going to come out on May 13th, which leaves about 2.5 weeks left of school. Turn your stuff in, right? These assignments do count. If you're missing any, go back and look in Power School in your email. I've been emailing you and probably talking to your parents as well. I hope you're staying healthy, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.